Chapter 15. LSD. A few key facts. LSD is a synthetic variant of the ergot fungus. It's an exceptionally potent synthetic psychedelic. It came to prominence recreationally in the turn-on, tune-in and drop-out era of the West Coast USA in the 1960s. It's consumed orally, sometimes on blotting paper or a sugar cube. Intoxication can last many hours, and some effects include perceptual alterations, time distortion, vivid colours and shapes, and mood alterations. Albert Hofmann, the scientist who discovered LSD, slightly disputes the widely held story that he stumbled upon its hallucinatory effects accidentally. Hofmann was part of a programme of work at Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company in Basel in northwestern Switzerland, which consisted of investigating compounds that were related to naturally occurring organisms. His particular interest lay in ergot, a fungus that had previously been responsible for mass poisonings in the Middle Ages, known as St. Anthony's Fire, but had recently been found to have medicinal properties as well. In 1938, he extracted one of many lysergic acid derivatives as part of this research. Lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD-25. It was the 25th derivation of ergot that Hofmann had investigated. After a little research on animals, it was shelved, as it didn't look particularly novel or exciting to the company. But, as Hofmann describes in his autobiography, he felt a peculiar presentiment, the feeling that this substance might possess properties beyond those established in the first pharmacological studies, and 5 years later he resynthesized LSD in order to investigate it further. The story goes that while synthesizing it, he got some on his fingers and experienced the first LSD trip. But according to Hofmann's autobiography, that's not quite what happened. He writes that he had to interrupt the end of the synthesis process as he was feeling dizzy and restless. After the weekend, he deliberately sampled what he believed to be a tiny dose of LSD and, under the watchful eye of an assistant, proceeded to have an extreme intoxication experience, the first LSD trip. His lab notes of the time state that he took the LSD heavily diluted in water at 4:20 p.m, started to feel dizzy and anxious at 5 p.m, and described the time between 6 and 8 p.m. as most severe crisis. He believed his neighbour to be a malevolent witch and thought that he was dying. It was also during this period that he cycled home, a bicycle ride now famous in counterculture, with bicycles often appearing on tabs of LSD, and many celebrating Bicycle Day on the 19th of April in his and LSD's honour. It might be hard to see the appeal of LSD from Hofmann's initial quite terrifying experience. However, even during that first trip, he saw an appeal after the initial horror passed. He described kaleidoscopic, fantastic images and synesthesia-like effects where everyday sounds would become moving and unique visual perceptions. People consume LSD recreationally because they want to have a trip. They want to experience these audio and visual hallucinations. It's quite a different drug-taking experience than many other recreational drugs, which are often taken to enhance social experiences. Although people do take LSD in groups, the experience is often very personal and inward-facing. And while listening to music while on LSD might be pleasant, it's not necessarily a drug that will make you want to get up and party. Although it has been associated with certain musical scenes, such as the 1960s acid psychedelia culture and the psychedelic trance music of the 1980s. What are the short-term effects? If you take LSD, you are in for the long haul. Intoxication experiences tend to last many hours, sometimes 7, 8, or even longer. LSD is generally swallowed and is absorbed through the lining of the stomach, so the onset of intoxication is not as immediate as drugs that are snorted or injected. Intoxication will usually start around half an hour to an hour after consuming the drug, which is often taken on a tab or blotter, a small amount of liquid diluted LSD absorbed into paper or sometimes a sugar cube. As well as visual and auditory hallucinations, someone tripping on LSD will likely experience distortions of time and space. Researchers have attempted to quantify the LSD intoxication experience. Studies where participants have been given LSD or placebo have found evidence that LSD alters the state of consciousness for those who take it. People experience audio-visual synesthesia, where two senses become linked and one can cause an experience of the other, feelings of bliss, and feelings of derealization or depersonalization, although these are usually reported as positive. LSD can also influence emotional responses to experiences and can induce mystical experiences in some who take it. I asked people who use LSD to attempt to describe what intoxication feels like. Petula told me how difficult it is to explain psychedelic intoxication to someone who has not used the drug, stating it was like trying to describe colour to a person who's never been able to see. Colour is something that a number of people mentioned, from colours looking more vivid to objects changing colour when examined. Domingo from Little Oakley described fabric looking like it starts to breathe. Other people reported this for other textured surfaces. Nature was important to a number of people. Trees and clouds filled me with a childlike sense of awe. Annika told me she limits her LSD use to during the day, as at night shadows are everywhere and it feels hard to make out where I am or what is really happening. I dislike it. It's very hard to overdose physically on LSD. A person would need to take hundreds of times the usual dose to reach toxicity. And so, unlike a lot of other drugs, there aren't direct physical dangers from taking a little too much. It doesn't seem to impact on heart rate, blood pressure, or increase your likelihood of passing out, like many other substances do. That said, the size of the dose you take can impact on the intensity and length of the trip you experience. So if you're planning to use LSD, it's still far better to start with a small dose rather than risking a larger one before you know what intoxication is like. Once you have consumed it, there's very little you can do until the trip is over, which can take many hours. Like a lot of drugs, the experience you will have on LSD can be influenced by where you are and how you're feeling when you take it, the set and setting. But with LSD, given the profound impact it can have on perception, misjudging this can be particularly unpleasant. A bad trip is when the perceptual alterations experienced are negative. One person I spoke to about their LSD experience described bad trips as occurring when she had bad feelings about the people she was with. It was like I could see through their poker face. Another person told me of an avalanche of negative thoughts and emotions, but passed after 10 to 15 minutes. It can really exacerbate anxiety and self-confidence issues. I felt like everyone knew how weird I looked. I felt like I might have seriously damaged my mental health and I wouldn't come back from it. However, a number of people were keen to point out to me that although the negative experiences might be unpleasant at the time, they welcomed the learning that the experiences brought them, some saying they did not regret having the experiences. What are the longer-term effects? Given that LSD has very little physical intoxication effect, it is perhaps unsurprising that it also appears to have little impact on long-term users physically. However, there are suggestions that using LSD could impact on mental health, although whether for good or ill is harder to tell, as the evidence seems to point in both directions. Some people report improvements in psychological well-being. Other people find that it can bring painful emotional material to the surface, and therefore they can be psychologically agitated by using it. It is certainly a drug not recommended for people who have a family history or high risk of mental health problems like psychosis or schizophrenia. It's not common, but LSD use has occasionally triggered mental health problems that can be long-lasting. There are links between past psychedelic use and liberal political views. Perhaps LSD causes these liberal feelings, although it's also likely that liberal people are more likely to take LSD in the first place. Interestingly, the same study found that cocaine use or alcohol use didn't predict these same liberal values. A small-scale, unblinded study found long-lasting personality changes after a single dose of LSD in a lab, with people reporting the experience as being one of the most meaningful or spiritual in their lives. LSD doesn't seem to be addictive, which isn't to say that some people don't use it regularly. But there are some properties of LSD that mean it's not a substance that is used daily. Tolerance for the drug, where increasingly high doses are needed to feel an effect, happens quickly, and this includes cross-tolerance from other psychedelics like psilocybin, magic mushrooms. As such, if you take LSD the day after a trip, it won't really have an effect. Lucy described herself as a regular user of LSD, and told me that meant using it about 4 times a year. This is quite different to a regular user of other substances in this book. I'm a regular caffeine user. I'll use it multiple times a day. Regular smokers are also likely to use daily. Regular MDMA or cocaine use might mean monthly. regular alcohol use is likely to mean more than weekly, potentially daily. Partly, this may be due to tolerance building up, although this is usually resolved within days rather than months. But also, as she put it, it's heavy stuff. She described it as a drug that you have to prepare for, be in the right frame of mind for, put aside time for, and respect. Of course, not all people will use LSD in this way, and there is a dose-dependent effect, meaning smaller doses might not be so psychologically intense as Lucy describes. Myths and misconceptions. LSD will make you think you can fly and you'll jump off a building. LSD is a drug that has a huge amount of mythology associated with it. Lots of these myths begun in the 1960s, where the rise in use of LSD brought about a rise in moral panic along with it. A myth often portrayed in the media is that LSD will make you think you can fly and result in you jumping off a building or out of a window. Accidents can most certainly happen while intoxicated on LSD, due to the nature of the perceptual distortions a person can experience. But whether people are deliberately trying to fly, or rather being less careful than they usually would, similar to how people behave when intoxicated on alcohol, for example, is harder to say. Drugs and heights do not mix. There are many instances of people intoxicated on alcohol falling from balconies or other high places, yet no one would claim that alcohol might make you think you can fly. So this is probably a myth. LSD will mess up your chromosomes. In the late 1960s, a number of high-profile research papers were published that seemed to suggest that LSD might alter or damage chromosomes, the genetic material that we each contain in every one of our cells. Papers investigating this in animals like rats and in blood samples from humans were published in big-name journals like Nature and Science. However, a number of similar studies were also published where no such results were found. All of these studies were really small-scale, for example looking at only a handful of individuals, and some, in the case of animal studies, were giving doses of LSD far larger than humans would be likely to take. A review was published in 1971 that weighed up all the evidence from these papers and concluded that LSD in moderate doses does not cause detectable genetic damage. But not before the studies that suggested harm made headlines across the USA and further afield around the world. There was one group that the authors recommend to avoid LSD. Despite concluding that there was no strong evidence that LSD harmed unborn fetuses, the authors of the review suggested that the use of any drug during pregnancy should only occur if the benefits are strongly shown to outweigh the harms. This advice was not specific to LSD. As an aside, one researcher even examined the chromosomes of Timothy Leary himself. He was reportedly incredibly surprised to find that of 200 cells examined, only 2 showed any chromosomal damage, and that seen was really mild. A negative finding in a man who may have used LSD more than anyone else. So this is a myth. LSD is stored in human fat, or the spine, and can be released at any time, sending you tripping unexpectedly. There are also other myths related to the body. One is that LSD gets stored in human fat or at the base of the spine, meaning that it could be released at any time and cause an unexpected trip or a flashback. This is nonsense. A human body will metabolize a dose of LSD within a day, and the metabolites will be excreted out in urine. And what about flashbacks themselves? Many people will have heard urban myths of elderly people who have taken LSD in their youth suddenly having an unexpected flashback with horrific consequences. There is some evidence to suggest that some individuals who use LSD will experience after effects in the days and maybe even weeks following a trip. There is also a much rarer condition known as hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, or HPPD. While there have been case reports of this happening, rarely after 1 or 2 uses of the drug, it's more likely to happen to people who use LSD regularly over a number of years, and even then it's uncommon. Researchers who have tried to investigate flashbacks and HPPD have tended to do so via surveys. They've found that 1 in around 50,000 people who use psychedelics report symptoms of HPPD that go beyond minor flashbacks and into something more disruptive to their lives and potentially quite distressing. So, it's a myth. LSD can wreck your mental health. What about the mind and brain? There is a widely held belief that for some people LSD can cause schizophrenia or other severe mental health problems. And there are anecdotal reports of this, but it's challenging to research rigorously. It is the case that LSD can bring traumatic memories or thoughts to the surface, which can be extremely unpleasant, but whether this can then tip over into a serious mental health disorder is harder to prove or disprove. As with many of these substances, it's difficult to do the research, so just because there's no evidence doesn't mean we can't be certain that this isn't a risk. And given the type of experiences people can have, lights and trails across their vision, or palinopsia, the perception of an object permanently just out of view, it's a risk that shouldn't be written off. So this is unclear or partly true. LSD will open up parts of the brain that aren't normally used. People also think that LSD can open up parts of the brain that are not normally used. I think this is related to the myth that we only use 10% of our brains, and don't even get me started on that one. Certainly, people report a change in perception after using LSD, and potentially even a change in the way they think about the world, but that doesn't mean they're using more of their brain than they were previously. Having said that, new neuroscientific evidence could suggest that the way the brain is being used might change while a person is intoxicated. Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris is the head of psychedelic research at Imperial College London. Along with Professor David Nutt and a number of other colleagues, Robin has run some pioneering studies investigating how the brain works while under the influence of LSD. In one study, they put 20 individuals in a magnetic resonance imager, MRI, brain scanning machine, once whilst intoxicated and once whilst not. Comparing the two brain scans for each individual, they found striking differences in the functional connections across the brain. While on LSD, there was more global activity across the brain, and regions that weren't usually linked showed connections. Obviously, this is one small-scale study, and given the perceptual alterations that happen while being intoxicated, in a way, it's not surprising that there are these noticeable brain differences while intoxicated, but it's fascinating nonetheless. The authors suggest that perhaps the LSD-intoxicated brain is more similar to that of a child, where rigid or restricted thinking patterns have not yet become entrenched. There's another widely held belief about LSD that it improves creativity. Certainly a number of creative individuals have used it, from Aldous Huxley to the Beatles, and there's even an unsubstantiated rumour that Kary Mullis, the Nobel Prize winner, told Albert Hofmann that LSD had helped him to develop the chemical advances that would win him the Nobel. But once again, we're drawn to that thorny cause and effect problem. Does LSD make people creative, or are creative people more drawn to seek out these types of experiences? So, it's a myth. Orange juice will impact on LSD intoxication. Some people believe that drinking orange juice will reduce a bad trip, while other people believe it'll enhance the intoxication experience. Clearly both can't be true. There's also another urban myth about a man on LSD believing he was an orange, or sometimes a glass of orange juice, and believed this for the rest of his life. There's no evidence that orange juice or vitamin C has any effect on LSD. I don't know how this myth started, but I wonder whether it's linked to another citrus fruit, grapefruit. Individuals prescribed a variety of medications that metabolized by a particular enzyme, the catchily titled CYP3A4, are advised not to drink grapefruit juice because it can block the action of this enzyme and affect their action. Drugs that might be affected include certain types of statin, blood pressure drugs, anti-anxiety drugs, and a number of others. The effects are also seen from Seville oranges, pomelos, and tangelos, other citrus fruits and hybrids. There's no evidence that LSD is affected by these fruits, but it's possible something got lost in translation somewhere and an urban legend was born. So it's a myth. Does LSD have any medical uses? When LSD was initially discovered and its effects were beginning to be made known, there were high hopes for it to be of use to psychiatry in a number of ways. Firstly, given the perceptual alterations, there was a suggestion that studying LSD intoxication could reveal secrets about mental health, given the similarities between the hallucinations and delusions of LSD and conditions like psychosis. But researchers also wondered whether it could be used as part of psychotherapy. Initially, in the 1950s, this was mainly to treat alcohol dependence, neurosis, and psychosomatic disorders. Early trials found evidence to support LSD-assisted therapy in reducing anxiety, depression, and pain in individuals with late-stage cancer. These studies were somewhat limited in that it's very difficult to blind such studies. It quickly becomes apparent whether a person has been given a hallucinogen or not, and this lack of blinding can introduce bias to studies. While some research continued over the 1980s and 1990s in Europe, particularly in Switzerland, only recently has research begun again in the USA. In 2014, researchers associated with MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, published one of the first controlled studies of LSD-assisted psychotherapy in 40 years. This study was very small scale. Only 12 patients with anxiety associated with life-threatening illness were recruited into the study. They were able to blind the participants and researchers to the experimental condition of the patients by using what's known as an active placebo, a drug that also produces noticeable effects that might lead the participant or the researcher to think that the patient is in the experimental condition. In this case, they used a lower dose of LSD, 20 micrograms as compared to 200 micrograms in the experimental condition. Participants undertook 2 LSD or active placebo-assisted psychotherapy sessions. Then 2 months later, their anxiety was measured again. This study was never designed to show a clinical effect. The purpose of such a small study is to investigate how well patients tolerate LSD and to ensure that there are no safety issues from administering it. The results were really positive, with participants not showing any adverse responses to LSD that persisted more than 1 day after treatment. They also found, 12 months after treatment, a reduction in both state and trait anxiety, which seemed to be sustained for 12 months. Of course, in such a small study, we can't conclude too much, but these are tantalising results, and when considered alongside the studies of psilocybin, really might suggest a psychedelic medicine renaissance is on the horizon. However, whether delivering such a treatment on an already overstretched health service would be possible, even if it were found to be beneficial, is another question. Microdosing, fad or fantastic? In recent months and years, when LSD is mentioned, if it's not a discussion of the psychedelic research detailed earlier, it's about microdosing. This is the concept of taking subperceptual amounts of LSD, or other psychedelics, usually psilocybin, to improve cognition, perception, mental health, business acumen, you name it really. As yet, there are no rigorous trials into the effects of microdosing, although research is ongoing. Qualitative research is also being undertaken, but there's a big risk of a placebo effect here. People who microdose know that they're microdosing, so while they might experience an effect, it could also be due to expectation. People expect to feel better, and so it comes to be. There's also very little consistency in how people microdose, from what amount of LSD to take to the schedule you follow. Some people will take a tiny amount every day for a few months. Others are convinced that a 1 day on, 2 days off schedule is the best regimen to follow. Quite how widespread this behaviour is also unknown right now. For all the headlines that microdosing is endemic throughout Silicon Valley, we really have no idea how many people have tried it, for how long, and what the impact on them has been.